Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Paul, and in this ReadyGamingTech.com video, we're going to be discussing as well as analysing tech news which, as usual, has popped up in the past 24 or so hours. Hopefully, you're having an amazing day. We have tons of stuff to get through in today's video. I want to start things out, though, with some updated information concerning the clock frequency for the next generation of Ryzen processors known as Vermeer. These will, of course, be based on the Zen 3 processor architecture, and we do know that these CPUs will retain the same core and thread count as what we have for the Ryzen 3000 series. So, for example, we will see an 8-core model, a 12-core model, and a 16-core model, along with, of course, the lower-end SKUs. I first leaked this quite some time ago, as well as the fact that most likely the next generation of Ryzens will not have a drastically improved clock frequency compared to what we have with the 3000 series. And, well, Igor over at Igor's lab has actually found further information concerning the clock frequency, and it appears that the speed for these CPUs is currently at 4.8 GHz, although it is worth noting that these are still engineering samples. Possibly we will see even higher clock frequencies for final production silicon, maybe 4.9 or that magical 5 GHz, perhaps for cherry-picked samples, or the 4950, or maybe the 5950, we'll get into the name in just a second. So this does go very well with what I said previously, and also marries up, of course, with the fact that we see 4.7 GHz for the top of the current stack, which is the 3950, and that, of course, hits 4.7 GHz. Let's be very conservative and say that AMD do not get additional clock frequency over these engineering samples. So let's just say it does stick at 4.8 GHz. I don't see how even Rocket Lake is going to compete with this, because ultimately we have now a CPU which is getting close to the clock frequencies of Intel's flagship CPUs, but it's made worse because we also have higher IPC. The rumor is that Rocket Lake is going to be about 10 to 15% over Skylake, but we're hearing around 15% IPC for Zen 3 as well. Obviously, it does depend on whether it's an integer or a floating point workload for either CPU, but the rumor has it that, well, Rocket Lake is only going to be hitting 8 processor cores, which should still be adequate for gaming, but it's really going to come down to pricing at that point. I wouldn't be surprised if in some titles Intel do leave the crown to AMD to take. I think in certain games Intel still will reign supreme, depending on the final clock frequency of Rocket Lake, which is unfortunately still the big question. We're expecting around 5 GHz-ish, based on the fact that it's a 14 nm process, which is, well, obviously, let's face it, mature at this point. But, yeah, I mean, what's the price difference going to be? If, for example, you're looking at 500, I'm saying this in complete ignorance with the final prices of what Intel charge for the next-gen chips, but let's just say that they're charging like $500 for a 8-core processor, and you can get an AMD CPU for the same kind of price, but it's 12 cores instead. Yeah, I think a lot of folks are just going to jump on this, and also given the fact that the level 3 cache of these CPUs is going to be obviously acting very differently, especially for the 8-core models, it could be that even the 8-core CPUs, which we'll assume is the 4700, actually may do a very good job of competing with Intel's flagship processors for gaming, which could be disastrous. I actually hope Intel are competitive, because I don't want, just a one-horse race. We saw that back with the FX days with AMD, and it just isn't good for competition. But who knows? We can only wait and see. And also, we'll spend just a second to point out that there are rumours that the CPUs will not be known as the Ryzen 4000 series. Instead, AMD are considering marketing them as the Ryzen 5000 series, and this is according to a very well-known leaker on Chip Hell, WJM47196. I know, the username just rolls off the tongue, doesn't it? But allegedly, this is because AMD don't want confusion over the naming schemes, and honestly, I don't like, for example, the fact that Renoir is 4000 series. I think consistency over the naming scheme for the APUs from the beginning would have been good, but perhaps AMD at this point are just kind of, I don't know, trying to rebrand and make things easier for end users. I would honestly be very surprised if it did end up being the 5000 series, but I'm saying that in ignorance. I will be interested to see. And we also have some information for the next generation of AMD GPUs as well, which of course will be the RX 6000 series, and this primarily revolves around Navi 21, which is going to be the biggest piece of silicon in that particular lineup. And what we understand is that these GPUs are going to launch in the latter part of this year. It's looking like perhaps November, maybe October for these GPUs, which, yeah, I'm not surprised, honestly, given the things that I've already covered before, that there were some delays with getting some of the RDNA 2 features working correctly. I covered that more extensively in the PS5 APU bring-up though. But there were some rumours that have been swirling on the Chinese PTT forums. Obviously, you should definitely take this with a lot of salt. But also from the same leak that I just mentioned from Chip Hell, WJM. And essentially what we have here is rumours that we will see two variants of memory configurations for Navi 21, a 16 and a 12 gigabyte card, which you could assume anyway means either a 512 or 384-bit memory bus, which would be, well, let's just be honest, a lot of RAM. 16 gigabytes though for the next generation may make sense. After all, given that the fact that the PlayStation 5, for example, has a super fast SSD, and the fact that the Xbox also certainly has no slouch for an SSD, getting data from a slower drive into the system is going to be a bit of a pain in the ass. But this can be somewhat brute forced simply by having a lot of video RAM and main system memory, along with, of course, perhaps an NVMe drive. But we have discussed this previously. Ultimately, I don't think 8 gigabytes for a flagship model makes any sense, and 12 gigabytes or 16 gigabytes would also match up with something else, and that is that I've been getting a lot of marketing from AMD, not just for review purposes, but also kind of just as an end user, that they're pushing that lower end cards should have at least a minimum of 6 gigabytes. So obviously they're pushing the narrative of increasing the amount of VRAM for future GPUs. Also, I got fed a bit of a tidbit myself for the next generation cards. This is a small exclusive, but I'm just going to throw it in here as it's not a super amount of information. But basically, I got told that the RDNA 2 architecture is more efficient from what my source has been hearing than Ampere, and apparently AMD have been targeting a 250 watt GPU for some time for the flagship model. I'll be interested if that's actually true, as there were some rumours that it was going up to 300 watts, but apparently that was not true and it's 250 watts. Furthermore, efficiency for AMD's CPUs and GPUs and other products has apparently been a very high priority. I got told that there's strike teams, I don't want to quote too much from my source directly, but that's what I was told, within AMD, which are basically focusing on silicon optimization and going from one project to another project to make sure that the silicon is as optimized and efficient as possible. I first mentioned this with very early reports for RDNA 2, that I got told that the efficiency teams that were working on Zen, obviously we learned officially that some of those got split to RTG, Radeon Technology Group, but in my report I mentioned that the RDNA 2 architecture is the first architecture which really benefits from that optimization. And we've also seen it somewhat as well being kind of proven with AMD's own slides, not just with the IPC gains that we've seen in the slides that AMD are claiming, but furthermore also energy efficiency. So do I think that they can be more efficient than Ampere? Well, it would require silicon engineering to be very impressive. As one thing I'll give Nvidia is that they know how to optimize silicon, and it's worth noting, of course, that Pascal was, well, incredibly efficient. And we saw the same with Turing. Like, energy efficiency-wise, Turing, quite honestly, stomped Vega, the 14, as well as 7nm. And the first generation of Navi is not exactly super-duper energy efficient, despite the fact it's on a 7nm process. But perhaps we will see things improve. After all, Ryzen is pretty energy efficient, and I assume it's going to be even more energy efficient with the next generation. Also, I have a small thing for the PlayStation 5, and it concerns the colours of the Dualsense controller. And we do actually seem to have confirmation, he says, with a voice which implies take massive truckloads of salt, please, that there will be a black variant of the controller. And this is apparently backed up by the fact that the source of the picture is from Taiwan NCC. Basically, you can think of that as the FCC, which likely, and I do stress the word likely, means that it's official. And this is also further confirmed by Robert Serraro as well, who has also provided a link to it. So this obviously has still not been announced by Sony, and just because something has been filed, even if it's official, doesn't not necessarily mean that it's going to become a working product, much like I keep saying about patents. A patent is a patent. A patent does not necessarily become a product, but it's looking very likely that Sony will do this. I know I am probably in the minority here, but I don't really care about colours and stuff of like controllers and consoles. I think it's kind of cool that you can customize the plates of the PlayStation 5, the blades, whatever you want to call them. I think that's pretty awesome. But honestly, it could be pink with green dots on it for all I care. I'm much more focused on whether the console's A, cool, B, quiet, and I don't actually care about much other stuff, to be honest with you, with the system. As long as the console is not so big and heavy that it threatens to demolish the floor and break through it if it falls over, I don't really care too much. I've mentioned multiple times before that I was actually quite a big fan of the original Xbox design in terms of aesthetics. So, yeah, Duke controller for the win, in my personal opinion. And I also would like to tackle something for the Xbox as well, as this has been absolutely blowing up the last hour or so on social media, and I've gotten tagged and DM'd about this a couple of times already, and it concerns the Medium, which of course we saw at the Xbox Games Showcase. I have to say, it looks very pretty, this title, and obviously there was a lot of fuss made over the fact that the game's only running at 30 FPS for the Xbox, which honestly I'm not surprised. I mean, yeah, just not only are the graphics impressive, but you're essentially rendering two variants of the scene, which I would be shocked if that's not really hammering the system. But anyway, a number of individuals have noticed a curiosity for the Xbox.com webpage for the Medium. And that is that hardware-based ray tracing is no longer listed. Instead, it's now listed as just 4K and 4K Ultra HD. But if you use the Wayback Machine, I'll put a link to it in the description as well, you will notice that hardware-based ray tracing is listed. But I will also point out that if you go to the official webpage for the medium, they do specifically, at least as the time I'm recording this, so maybe this will change in 5 minutes, but they are still listing that it does indeed have hardware-based ray tracing as well as 4K. So what are my thoughts on this? Honestly, it's pre-production software. And they may just be removing this just to cover their asses. Maybe they're concerned over the performance of the game and frame rate stability or something like that. Honestly, no one really knows, and I don't think people should freak out about this yet, given the fact that it's not even officially announced, and also the fact that we don't even have it listed on the, the company's own page that it's being removed. Rather interestingly, if you look at the Steam page for this game, you can also see that to run it with hardware-based ray tracing enabled, they are suggesting that you're using an RTX 2080, not a Super or a Ti, just the vanilla RTX 2080. The problem I have with minimum specs of games on PC is quite frequently they don't provide details of how well that's playing. So, for example, is that with the RTX 2080 running at 60 FPS on average, or is it 30 FPS, or what? Like, what am I getting for that? What about resolution? What about the rest of the quality options? And so on and so on. I can't remember offhand whether this supports DLSS, the medium. Hopefully it does, because that would be, well, let's just say spiffy. Personally, I think the medium looks really cool. And honestly, some of the implementations of hardware-based ray tracing have not been perfect either. A great example of this would be Ratchet & Clank. And you can see that there are certain elements of Ratchet & Clank which don't work correctly. And it would be interesting if hardware-based ray tracing could be enabled. For example, with reflections from objects that are in portals, I noticed that. But here's the thing. It's still really bloody early in this generation. And so I think if this game came out, or any of these games came out in like 2 years, it would be very different. I think developers will start to understand how this hardware works, but you've got to remember that it's not just that they're trying to figure out how to get the most out of the CPU, the GPU, but also they're trying to figure out APIs, any last-minute updates from Microsoft or Sony, and also it's the way that the games themselves are being designed is very different for the next generation, because a lot of the ways that were kind of performance-saving measures with, for example, let's take Ratchet & Clank, when you're going through one of those portals, you're essentially entering like a different reality, a different world, a different level. And traditionally, you would have had to have quite a long load screen for that. So it's kind of like, I don't understand right now how they've actually done it, and by which I mean I don't know how the engine is handling pulling in those assets, because obviously I don't have access to a developer who's giving me all that information for obvious reasons. It would be proprietary to the studio right now, and B, probably they're still figuring some of this stuff out themselves. So it's like, what happens if certain objects are through portals? Can that light interact with things, or are there limitations at the moment just with the way that it's streaming in assets and all of this stuff? And the answer to some of this is probably it will be worked on and it will get better. So for the medium, is hardware-based ray tracing going to be on the game? I probably suspect it will be for the Xbox, but it's, once again, pre-production software. I'll also spend a moment just to say that if this is true, and I do stress if it's true, and the Xbox does not have hardware-based ray tracing with the medium, it could certainly be patched in later, which is definitely a possibility. And it's also interesting because there are certainly major benefits of having additional compute units over clock frequency, and I've discussed these several times in the past. I'll try to remember to link one of my videos, which was a little bit older now, a couple of months old, where I was going kind of into the architecture of the PS5 and Xbox as why they've kind of gone these different routes. Basically, the lower clock frequency of the Xbox's GPU means that they do have less throughput for other things as well, like geometry and data. But it also does affect hardware-based ray tracing too. The additional compute units does mean that they have the ability to have more BVH going on, which is definitely good. That means, by the way, bounding volume hierarchy, which is basically where they're sending rays out into the scene, which essentially obviously means that they can calculate or have more sources of where, for example, things are interacting with geometry and whatever else. But the downside is that the clock speed of those operations is also lower than the PlayStation 5. So basically you've kind of got this trade-off of, do you want basically fewer rays bouncing into the scene, but those rays could also hit more stuff and basically the GPU can do more work, or would you prefer the reverse? And there is definitely benefits to both, and I am vastly simplifying this for the video because I've gone into it much more extensively a few times in the past, but I would be very curious if this is true for the game. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised either way. I think there will definitely need to be concessions, especially for the launch titles. So the Medium is a very ambitious game. I think it's going to really hammer even high-end PCs, to be totally honest. I think that, let's say if you've got like a 2060 Super, you're not going to be running this with all the bells and whistles enabled. Let's put it that way, at high frame rates. And there is one last little thing for the Xbox, and this actually tackles the Xbox Live Gold becoming, well, not gold, as Microsoft have claimed that there are no changes being made to Xbox Live Gold. If you're unfamiliar with the backstory for this, basically there has been a lot of speculation and multiple reports that we will see multiplayer become free for the Xbox Series X. And one of the reasons that this was kind of, well, spurred on is because of Halo Infinite, with obviously the Halo Infinite online campaign being apparently free to play. But according to Microsoft, this is not going to happen. And instead, basically, a Microsoft spokesperson told VGC, Video Games Chronicle, I'll of course link that article in the description, the update to Xbox Online Services is Microsoft Agreement Service refers to underlying Xbox service that includes features like cross-saves and friend requests. This language update is intended to distinguish the underlying service and the paid Xbox Live Gold subscription. There are no changes to the experience of the Xbox service or Xbox Live Gold. So it seems like we are not going to see it become free. But they also added that at the time Xbox decided to remove the 12-month subscription from an online store, and customers can still sign up for a 1 or 3 month, which is still weird why they would remove the 12 months, which would be another reason it would kind of point to Microsoft removing this particular tier and just making it free, which I still think is possible. Maybe they're just not ready to announce it, or this spokesperson didn't have access to this information, because honestly, plans like this may not be common knowledge within the company. I'm not saying that they will do it. I'm hoping that they will. I think Sony should do the same thing. I think it'd be pretty cool, but who the hell knows? Anyway, with that said, thank you very much for watching the video. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.